everyone. Welcome to Geotab's Wildcard Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shay Green. I'm a learning consultant here at Geotab. For today, we'll be hearing from Kyle Dodsworth, a solutions specialist team lead, and he'll be discussing insights and answers for ELD, along with some best practices to keep your fleet running smoothly at this time. With that being said, I'm going to hand things over to Kyle to get started.
Perfect. Thanks, Shay. And thanks everyone for joining today. I know in these times we have lots of people who are really busy because they have a lot on their plate right now, and we definitely appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk to us today. So as Shay mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about ELD in the current climate right now. And what we're going to focus in on is some things to kind of keep in mind as you are working away, whether you're super busy and you've got a ton of ELD information coming in because all of your drivers are working overtime, or on the other hand, if it's something where right now you've only got a few drivers running, we wanted to make sure that we keep our eye on certain things inside of the ELD solution so that when everything does get back to normal, you don't end up with a whole ton of extra work. We want everyone to be raring and ready to go when we can get back to normal. So just a quick agenda. First, we want to make sure that everybody knows where you can go and get information as it's coming out. Things change so very rapidly, as we can see over the last couple of weeks. So we wanted to make sure that we can give you as many links to different places. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Then in terms of the important things that I thought about while everyone is working right now, I want to make sure that we focus in on a few specific topics. So DVIRs, unverified logs, making sure people are logging out correctly in unassigned logs. The reason I wanted to focus on those four things is to make sure that you don't end up with issues later on down the line if we were starting to ignore those. On the topic of ignoring, I also want to talk about a feature that we have had in the system for quite a while, but I wanted to bring it up and talk about it specifically today, simply because it's not something that people use a lot, and it might be really handy in the next few months. So first and foremost, insights and where to find answers. I know that everyone has lots of things on their mind, and on that topic, we do also want to make sure that we send our appreciation out to everyone who is still on the road right now. Everyone, no matter if you're in the dispatchers or if you're actually driving, if you're an admin, really the people who are out there on the road right now are keeping everything stocked, keeping us basically alive right now. And we definitely want to have a hearty thanks to everyone in the trucking world. But what I wanted to show is something from the CVSA. So we're a member of the CVSA. I'm sure lots of people are also members of the CVSA, but they have actually generously created a web page, and it's not part of their membership. So it's a public website inside of their website that has over 30 links to different things that might come in handy for you. So I'm actually going to click on it here and show it off a little bit. So in this list are links to different associations. So like the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, so the AAMVA, the CCMTA, ATA. There's lots of things here that you might want to come in and look at. Specifically, the ones that I like to look at a lot because things are changing so much is this link here from the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators in Canada, and this first one here from the AAMVA. I've actually included links to these inside of the main presentation because these two actually give you tables of every state and province and what they've done in response to the COVID-19 impact. So if you want to know what Ontario has done in terms of transportation, you can actually click on this link and you can look at see exactly what Ontario has done in terms of what they have either restricted or suspended, and information directly from that particular province. And you can do that for all of the provinces using this link from the CCMTA. And then you up here, you can actually look at all of the states and their motor vehicle administrations, see exactly what's happening there when it comes to things like driver's licensing and registration, heavy vehicles, inspections, things like that. There's also the main link to the FMCSA about halfway down the page. That one's really good as well because the FMCSA is constantly updating what they're doing in terms of suspensions or changes or waivers. So they just released the new updated waiver for the COVID-19 emergency response last week. That's the best place to go and find it. So lots of links here from the CVSA, so we definitely want to extend our thanks to them for putting this out, and that's one that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned. And then these two are the ones that I've been following fairly closely from the CCMTA and the AAMVA. Really, really good information there. And you can also use this too to find out about things that you can do in your fleet. So if you go to those links, you can actually find out information about how to keep your fleet safe, how to do deep cleaning, things like that. So lots and lots of good information there, and want to make sure that I put it out there in one place so you don't have to worry about bookmarking 30 different links. You can go into that COVID-19 page from the CVSA. And if you aren't a member of the CVSA, you can also poke around a little bit and see if it's something that you might want to do. They're a great organization. They work really close with the industry and the FMCSA. They're the ones who do a lot of the inspection certifications and training. So when you do actually get inspected at the side of the road, the CVSA usually are the ones who've trained that person. So it's good to kind of know exactly what they're trained in. So it's a good organization to join if you want to. So with that aside, now we want to roll into the important topics that we want to talk about for the business challenges that you're facing right now. And again, these are all topics that we want to make sure that you are keeping up with inside of the ELD, so that way you don't end up having a pile of work when you're trying to get back to normal. We want to make sure that everyone keeps up with their regular day-to-day ELD, and that way when we get the green light and everything's back to normal, you can actually go back to normal. You won't have a ton of work left over for you. So the first one I wanted to talk about was DVIRs. We know that you're working longer hours, and we know that you might have more shipments to get out. You might be pushing the limits of what you would safely want to drive. So maybe you're not doing your DVIRs at all, and maybe you're not doing your DVIRs as well as you could. And you really want to make sure that your drivers are still doing their inspections. A missed item on a DVIR, that could result in a much larger issue during the day, or worse, it could actually be an accident. Now, inside of Geotab, we have two rules, and these are actually in the 2001 release. They came out of beta. They've been in for a couple releases in beta mode, but they're DVIR pre-trip missing and DVIR post-trip missing. This was a big ask that we've had for quite a while, to basically make it so that if you missed a DVIR, it popped up on a report. And these are the two rules that we created. Now, there's setup that you do have to put into these a little bit. There is a link, and you can go and look at the setup help, which goes over to our community. There's a link at the bottom of the page. But for instance, I'll talk about the DVIR pre-trip missing and what those two numbers mean, those 8 and that 8 and the 5. So the 8 hours is basically asking how much of a trip does it have to look for, and how far does that trip have to go before the system will realize that the pre-trip is missing. So in this scenario, if the vehicle is stopped for more than 8 hours and a driver jumps in and then drives for more than 5 kilometers without doing a pre-trip, this rule is going to break. And then you can then report on that just like any other rule. So if you're familiar with the exceptions reporting that you can normally do inside of Geotab, these rules apply just like that. So you can then create rules. The post-trip works similar. If the vehicle has stopped for 8 hours and it drove more than 5 hours before it stopped, and the system doesn't see a post-trip, it'll break that rule. So you can use these rules, put them onto reports, have emails sent out if you want to, just like a regular rule. They've got all of the regular options for notifications. And that way you can make sure that people are still doing the DVIRs like they should. Now, again, the post trips are the most important because you have to still do those. There's no suspension or waivers on CFR 396 right now. The pre-trips, most companies do have that as a policy, so you can toggle both or one of these on if you like, and then have a really, really good insight if DVIRs are being missed. As I said, really important to make sure that we still keep up with our vehicle maintenance, obviously, especially because you may have more wear and tear because you're driving more. And it's something that we really want to make sure we keep an eye on. And you don't want to have a lot of these missed, because if you do get inspected, or if you do go in for an annual, you might have a whole lot of extra work to do if you haven't caught some things that your drivers would have normally caught had they been doing their DVIRs. So wanted to mention this, A, because it is something that's just out of beta and it's available in the 2001 release, which just rolled out, but also it's really helpful in this particular case. It will automatically alert you if these DVIRs are missed. Now, another thing to talk about is unverified logs. Now, we do prompt the drivers to verify logs when they log in, if there's anything missing from yesterday. And when they log out, we say, hey, you want to verify your logs because you did a bunch of logs today. And of course, this also only applies to those drivers who are not operating under those waivers and if you're under a waiver and you're not creating logs, this doesn't apply. But if you are still creating logs, you want to make sure that drivers are doing this verify step. Now, you do have to verify logs at the end of every 24-hour period. There is obviously some leeway there, so you can actually do it later. But I have a feeling that some may be skipping this page because maybe they're just trying to get into the ELD. They don't want to have any extra time spent on screens. Maybe they're just skipping this when they log in, or, and probably more likely, they might have had a really long day, which we can definitely appreciate, and maybe they just don't want to do the whole log out process, so they're skipping this when they log out. But unverified logs are very easy to spot when you go through an inspection. And inspections are still happening. They aren't happening as much from the data that we can see, and we hopefully will be able to provide you some more data in the coming weeks about actual inspections that we're seeing across our organizations. But it's very obvious to an inspector if there's no verification date on a particular day. And that may result in violations. It could just be form and manner violations, but there's still violations nonetheless. So we have a report on the marketplace. It is free, and then you can add that to your dashboard or create it as an emailed report, either or both actually. And then you can have that sent out. Normally we might say weekly, but because of everyone maybe working really hard and maybe missing more of these verifying stages, you might want to have that send out daily to supervisors so they can keep a close eye on it. And just remind drivers, if you see a driver popping up on their report very regularly, just remind them that they do have to verify logs and give them that gentle poke, because if they do pile up, one, it's going to show up on those inspections. And two, if they do fall behind too much, the system actually won't let the drivers actually verify after those 14 days have elapsed. So you do want to make sure that they get to those verifications within 14 days of them being done. So the report will definitely help with that. And like I say, I recommend having it at first go out daily so you get a good handle on it, and then maybe switch it to weekly if you realize that everybody is verifying logs. And again, we do prompt the driver beginning and end of the shift, and drivers also can verify anytime during the day. If they are creating a lot of logs, if they're on a break, they might want to jump in, go into the log screen, click that verify button for that particular day, so there's less to verify at the end of the day. They can do that too. Now, another thing we wanted to talk about is logging out. Now, logging out is fairly self-explanatory, and we're hoping that everybody is logging out normally at the end of the day. The reason that we wanted to bring it up is because if you've worked an extra long shift, the last thing you might remember to do is log out of the ELD. You may just take the phone, throw it in your bag, throw it in your pocket, and not look at it because you've had a really long day, and we definitely get that. But if this is the case where you dropped your vehicle off at the depot or a distribution center or the mechanic, and then it's driven and you didn't log out, now you've got those drive logs on your driver and you can't get rid of them because the law says that you can't. So all you can do is go in there and annotate them and say, oh, that was a mechanic because the driver forgot to log out. Now, there's two things that we can do to combat that. The first one I want to talk about is actually a brand new feature that's inside of the 2001 release, and we call it proximity. Sorry, we don't have a fancy name for it, but what it does is it actually checks the GPS that's on the vehicle, so the Go device that's on the vehicle, and it checks periodically with the actual device that the driver is using, so the phone or the tablet that they're using inside of the cab. Now, this unfortunately won't apply to anyone who has the tablets mounted directly into the dash, but anyone who does let their drivers take that phone or tablet out with them, if they get more than 500 meters, so half a kilometer or 1,600 feet, which is like a third of a mile away from the vehicle, a little prompt pops up on Geotab Drive and says, hey, I've noticed that you're out of range of the vehicle. And if they say yes, they actually get prompted to go into that off-duty and disassociation right away. So it's a way that we can hopefully remind them that, hey, you're not near the vehicle anymore. We probably should get you disassociated. That way, they don't end up having drive logs assigned if there is any driving done overnight. If they say no or they close off this because maybe they are still wanting to be attached to the vehicle, it won't remind them over and over and over and over again. Once you say no, the little prompt won't remember, and it won't actually prompt you again until you pick a different vehicle or you log in and log out the next day. The other thing you could do, and this might be for maybe some more of our advanced users, is you could actually create a zone. So geofence out the places where your drivers usually leave the vehicles. And then when the vehicle enters that zone, you can create a rule that says, hey, if this vehicle goes into this zone between this time and this time every day, send a message down to the driver. And that message could simply be like, hey, welcome home. Just remember to log out of Geotab Drive, log out of the ELD before you go home for the day. So that could be a little proactive piece. So maybe they're warned that, hey, you're getting home, and log out, remember? And then proximity, if they forget. Hopefully between those two things, it might help to make sure that everyone's logging out at the end of the day correctly, which is just going to save everybody a lot of time and headache, because then any logs that are created by mechanics or yard jockeys will just be unassigned driving as normal, and you can assign those and annotate as you need to. But the main reason I wanted to put this up was just to talk about proximity a little bit, because it's a pretty neat feature and it is brand new from 2001. I know we talked about it a little bit inside of our what's new, but we wanted to kind of delve a little bit more into it because it is a pretty neat feature and hopefully should save a lot of people from having those logs end up on the wrong drivers. And lastly is those unassigned logs. So assuming that your drivers log out correctly, everything's fine. If the vehicle is moved, it's going to create those unassigned logs. And that's completely normal. That's exactly what the ELD mandate wants to happen. You're going to have unassigned logs, usually in yards a whole lot. And we've had a lot of times where there's just hundreds of tiny little moves in your yards. And they're all done by mechanics or yard jockeys. Those don't have to be in the ELD under a specific driver, because all of those drivers, well, they're not ELD drivers because they're not on the public road. So what we've done, and this is a rule that we've had again in beta for a little while, it came out of beta in 2001, to try to help identify any of those unassigned drivings that were done inside of one of your own zones. So inside of a distribution yard, or if you have a big mechanic yard, something like that. So under the fleet section in rules, and sorry, I apologize. The other rules that I mentioned in the DVIR, they're actually in a new section called compliance, which is just right after the fleet section. So at the bottom of the fleet section, though, you'll see this rule called vehicle movement within zones. It's a little bit of a generic name, but this is actually where we start to help you figure out what unassigned driving was done in a yard versus what unassigned driving was done on a public road. So the first thing that you would do is go into your zone list and make sure that all of the zones where any of these yard moves might be created all have the same zone type. So it could be that you've used the office type because that's the basic one that comes with the system, but you can also create your own custom zone type. So as long as all of your yards, or all of the places where these potential yard moves by mechanics and yard jockeys could have happened, are in one specific zone type, you would then turn on this rule, and in that zone type dropdown, just pick that zone type. Then just let your drivers do everything normally. Let them log out. Your mechanics are going to be doing some yard moves. What the system is going to be doing is making sure that every trip that's done without a driver that is entirely within that zone type that you've told it are then tagged as a potential yard move. And when you go over into the unassigned driving section of the HOS logs page, there's a new filter that pops up that says show only yard moves. And when you turn that to yes, it's then going to look up all of those little trips that are tagged with this little rule, and it's going to filter out only those. From there, it's a big giant list, and you can bulk annotate all of them in one shot to say that they were all done inside of your own yards. Once you've annotated an unassigned driving log, you don't have to touch it again. As long as you annotate it and you've got a good annotation on there, that's what the FMCSA expects, assuming that these were obviously legitimately done inside of a yard. Now, I know there is a few steps here, and once you set it up, it does become very easy to use. The reason that we have to do this particular mechanism and we have to have you do a bulk annotation is because the FMCSA said that we couldn't automate all of this. We did ask, and we asked a couple times in a couple different ways because we thought it would be way easier if you could do it just automatically. And they said that you had to have at least a human press at least one button. That's why we have the bulk annotation piece as the final step. But at least when you're faced with a large list of unassigned logs, you can easily get rid of all the stuff that is inside of your own yards, and what's remaining are those actual drives that are outside of your yard where drivers may have forgotten to log in. It's a lot easier to handle just that list instead of the list that's all jumbled with your own yard moves. The reason that you also want to make sure you have these unassigned logs annotated and you're on top of them is because just like unverified logs, they're really easy to spot in inspections as well. Unassigned logs, they're kind of the thing that officers look for, because if you have unassigned logs, they might think that maybe your drivers are not logging in while they're driving on the actual public road, which would be a red flag to them. So it's really a good thing to maintain your compliance with these unassigned logs and make sure you're on top of them. It makes roadside inspections a lot easier. And keep in mind, the things that we do now, they're still going to be in the system for at least 6 months. And if you do a safety audit or something like that in the future, you might still have these logs show up. So really important to make sure that you stay on top of unassigned logs, just like unverified logs, to make your life easier when everything goes back to normal. Okay. The last thing I wanted to talk about was a feature that we've had for quite a few releases, but it's been a little bit more prominent since the 2001 release came out. And it's called the ignore log feature. It's used to help correct availability. And I'll give an example as to what I mean by this if you haven't played with this feature before. Even if you have, hopefully I'll give you some insight as to why we created it and how it's supposed to work. So in a potential scenario, let's say a user generates an automatic log in error. The best case is a driver forgets to enable yard move, or maybe they forget to enable PC, and then they start driving. Well, the FMCSA has provided guidance on that exact scenario, and their answer is, well, just go in and annotate that drive log to say that it was yard move. That's all that they expect. Now, that's great for the mandate, and you can actually see their answer. It's in the ELD Tech FAQ. I've linked it here in case you want to look at it. So that is the exact answer that they want to see. So all they want to see inside of that particular log is that it's been annotated to say, I forgot to enable yard move. This is actually supposed to be a yard move. That's good for the mandate, but pretty much every ELD out there has an availability calculation engine built into it. And that's a feature of ELDs. It doesn't have to be there. However, I don't think anyone would buy an ELD that doesn't have it. And the problem with this scenario is that that's still a drive log when the availability engine looks at it. So it's thinking that that's an actual drive log. Now, the ignore log feature lets the admin correct that availability and essentially tell the availability calculation to not treat that as a drive log. So this is what it might look like, and I've actually exacerbated this yard move a lot just so that we could see it on the screen. Obviously, a yard move wouldn't actually be 3 hours long, but just for the purposes of this scenario, I want to have a big block of time on the graph that we could look at. So let's say that this driver realizes, or maybe the admin realizes, that that big 3 hours between 9 and 12 should have been a yard move or a PC. What the admin would be able to do is go and find that log in the driver's hours of service logs, click on that actual block of time, it'll bring you to the log, and at the very bottom of the screen, there's an ignored yes/no toggle. And I'll say no by default, but just simply press to yes. When you press yes, the system will prompt you for an annotation. So that's where the admin would put in that note. Driver forgot to use yard move, this should have been a yard move, or driver forgot to turn on PC, this should be PC. What that's going to do is it's going to gray out that log inside of your view as an admin. So it's going to have this little gray box kind of shading it, and you'll be able to see this little note, this log has been ignored, and driver forgot to use yard move. So that's the driver forgot to use yard move is what I typed in. The system will automatically put in for the admin that this log has been ignored. The reason we do that is because we want to make sure that the admin knows that this is an ignored log. Now in the Drive app, it's not going to say this log has been ignored. And the reason is we want to make sure that if this log is looked at by the FMCSA, there's no kind of question as to what's going on. The ignored part is something that we can do entirely on our own side because the FMCSA doesn't care about availability. But to tell the driver that you've done something, it will be dimmed out. So if you look at the big list, you'll see any ignored logs have a muted color, and they'll also be able to see the annotation that you put in. So you can see there, the driver put in an annotation, and then so did the admin in here. So the driver forgot to use YM, that's the admin's annotation, and then the driver also would put an annotation in here as well because he was a good driver, wanted to make sure that everyone knew what was going on. So we see those two annotations there, which is completely normal when more than one annotation applies. But what you don't see is that this log has been ignored prefix. We put that in only for the portal side on the admin side. We don't put that on anything that you might see as an officer. The reason is because for the purposes of availability, this log inside of my Geotab will not count as a drive log. In effect, when the availability calculator is scrolling along through this day, it will completely skip over that drive log and think it's not even there. What that does in this particular example is because the driver was on duty directly before that ignored log, the availability calculator will actually count this driver as on duty from 8 a.m. to 12. So that box right there. And that's because the on duty beforehand effectively ends at 12 because we ignored the beginning of that driving at 9 a.m. And for the purposes of our example, that's exactly what yard move is. It's on duty, not driving. So now this reflects what we want to see inside of the availability. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't add any new logs into the system. So sometimes, depending on what exactly you are ignoring, you might have to add a log in to get the log to be the correct status that you're thinking. Or you might actually have to add more than one ignore into the system. For example, there are times where you might have moved a vehicle and created a drive log. Well, that's going to create an on-duty log at the end of it by default. You might have to ignore both of those to get rid of both of them for availability purposes. So just kind of keep an eye on that. And again, you'll be able to check in the availability section of the hours of service if the ignores that you've put in are making the right changes. Now, again, this is only inside of the availability calculator on the My Geotab side. When we look at transferring these logs over, it's just going to transfer everything as usual. This is a feature only, and it only affects availability, and the FMCSA doesn't care about the availability that we calculate. They do their own calculations on their own side inside of eRODS. So good chance that when you do ignore and get the right availability that you want, the driver goes through an inspection, they're still going to be questioned as to what this log is supposed to be because it's still going to be on the drive line and it's going to have that annotation. So the driver will have to, again, say, hey, I forgot to use the yard move button. And the FMCSA side might show a violation somewhere because it's calculating it as drive. The officer is going to have to manually do the calculations for that particular day. And that's been the same way that it's been forever. That's why those annotations that you have to put in when you do the ignore are really important. Make sure that annotation explains what the heck it is that you're trying to correct, because the more detail you give to the officer via that annotation piece, the better. Now, there is a legal warning here. This functionality should only be carefully used to correct erroneous logs as they relate to the driver availability calculations within the ELD product. Incorrect use of this feature may result in incorrect driver availability reflecting within the ELD product, which can result in violations of the FMCSA or other applicable regulations, which is to basically say, make sure that you're really clear and you use this at your own discretion. We have a special 2-page document talking about just the ignore feature, exactly how it works, and some scenarios to which we thought it would be coming in handy, and you can find it by clicking that link at the bottom of the page there. If you do have issues with drivers logging out or co-drivers not logging in correctly, things like that, those are times where the ignore log feature may come in handy. Check the official documentation, and then you can go and make changes inside of the system. Just make sure that you heed the warning that we have. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the community really quickly. So the Geotab community is something that we launched very recently. We can create specific groups, and one of the first groups that we have is specifically for COVID-19. So it's the COVID-19 action group. You can find it directly on that link. If you're already in the community section, just go click on the groups and you can see it there. And it's what we're doing. We're kind of housing everything that we can find that might help. So we've got the links that I have here shown inside of that particular group. We have lots of people in the community they're contributing lots of different things. So definitely, if you're in the community, jump into that group and get notified about things as they come down that we can find. And that's it for my part. So we can open it up to questions. I have a feeling we would probably have quite a few if Shay wants to jump back in.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kyle. We do actually have a handful of questions here. I'm sure we'll get some more coming in. First one, it actually goes back to the kind of the start of the presentation. Is there a way to verify unassigned logs after that window closes?
The 14 days, not at this time. So that's one of the reasons why it is super important to get to it within your 2 times cycle. That's the way, basically the way the system looks at it. And the reason we do that is twofold. One, there is this little part of the actual 395 documentation that says that you're supposed to kind of give your logs within 13 days to your carrier. So that's kind of one reason why it's a 14-day window. The other reason is if we had to download every single log the driver ever created, just in case one of them happened to be unverified, that's thousands upon thousands of logs. So it would be really hard to log in. It would take a long time. There's a lot of horsepower there. So because of those 2 reasons, that's why it's a 14-day window. And that's why it's really important to make sure that you get on them. If you have drivers who are a little tardy in their verification, make sure that you get on them as fast as you can using that report and send it out to whoever needs to. Basically, whoever needs to know that their drivers aren't verifying fast enough, make sure you get that report out to them, send it to supervisors and things like that.
Alrighty, next question that we have here. Is there a plan to send multiple prompts if a driver selects no when prompted by the proximity feature?
Not yet, but it is a brand new feature. So we would love to get some feedback. If that's something that would help, we definitely could improve the feature. It's like I said, this feature is less than a month old because 2001 just started rolling out. So if you do have any kind of feedback for that, definitely you can either have drivers use the feedback button directly inside of the app is one option, or you could talk to your account manager or your reseller and they can relay it to us. But yeah, we're definitely open to making changes on that feature. We just for now didn't want to have something constantly remind drivers in case it was too intrusive. Obviously, we'll have to strike a balance as to how intrusive do we want versus how much is too much. But definitely give us feedback on it. It's something that we could certainly look at.
Alrighty, next question we have here is the logout reminder is great, but do you have to have the Drive app open to receive the prompt?
For now, yes, that it is a prompt on the actual screen in the app. And we are looking at being able to use the toast notifications, but that will be a next phase, simply because we have to make sure they work both in Android and iOS. And I will say it's the iOS side that takes longer to figure out. But as soon as we do, we're going to be able to look at getting those notifications through the native notification piece of iOS and Android. So it will be coming.
Awesome. Next question. Could we trigger a custom rule to email the driver when they enter the zone instead of the message being prompted through the app?
I can tell you the answer is technically yes. However, it requires a little bit more setup and an extensive use of grouping. So it is possible if an email notification to a driver would be a better option, but in order to get that to work, there's just a little bit of extra work, and you also have to make sure your driver's usernames are their emails. So if your users right now log in with like an ID and a password, you'd have to change it to be a username equals email instead. So still possible, just a little bit of extra setup time. And again, like a reseller or our support team or your account manager could help set that up.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. And next question we have for Kyle is, will the log ignore work for PC used for agriculture exemption moves?
You could. You could set it like that. However, the FMCSA still expects one of two options for agriculture, and it's either using PC or not logging in. I wouldn't recommend using the ignore feature simply because when you're using that particular exemption, you want it to treat it as off duty, and simply using the ignore button won't make that log an off duty. It would if there was an off duty directly preceding it. I would still recommend following what the actual FMCSA guidance was for using agriculture exemptions in ELDs and using PC. What I can also say, though, is that we have been working closely with the FMCSA on a different solution that still uses PC, but in a much easier way for people who are using exemptions that need PC. Because there's a few, like there's agriculture, there's utility exemption. It works in the exact same way. They say you should be using PC. And there's also this new waiver, the COVID-19 waiver that in that FAQ, it said basically do the same thing. Use PC when you're under the waiver. So because of those things, we've actually been working with the FMCSA to see if we can come up with a special exemption that would cover all of those types of cases and keep you in PC and make it a lot easier to stay in PC. So I can't say more than that because it's still under development and hopefully is going to be able to come out for the next release. But just keep an eye on the what's news is what I could say. And when we have more information on this, we'll let you know. So I know exactly where the question's coming up. It's a pain in the butt to use PC a lot because of the rules around PC, but we have a solution that we've talked to the FMC about, or FMCSA about, to make that easier. That's what I can say to that one.
Alrighty, next question we have is when will these features be available to customers?
So most customers should already be on 2001. It's been rolling out for a couple of weeks. If you don't have 2001 as your release yet, if you're still on 1904, it should be coming shortly within the next week or two. The best case though is talk to our support team, have your reseller or account manager put in a support ticket for you if you really need to know. But it should be rolling out, and just because we have so many customers, we have to do it in stages, but it will be coming shortly.
Alrighty, next question that we have is will logs auto-verify eventually?
No, the driver does have to actually click a button. It's like their signature, so they have to actually do something inside of the system.
All right, next question that we have here is there an option for yes and go on duty for the proximity prompt?
So that would mean they were off duty when we sent them the prompt, I would guess. There isn't an option. Again, we could look at adding it if that was the case, if drivers are going off duty and then walking away from the vehicle. The reason that it works the way that it works now is the scenario that we envisioned is that the driver gets home or gets to the terminal and then just walks away from the vehicle without doing really anything in the system at all, which means that they get put on duty when the vehicle stops after 5 minutes. So that's why the system sort of assumes right now that they're on duty and would want to go off if they're a third of a mile away from the vehicle. Again, open to options. So if it's not working for your particular scenario, just make sure to let us know with either feedback or mention to your reseller, and we can look at it again. Like I said, brand new feature, so we can definitely add lots to it. We just need to get some real world feedback to see if it's working as well as we hope for everybody. So just let us know if you think we need to tweak it.
Alrighty, next question we have here. In the unverified logs, how do you correct assigning an unverified log to the wrong driver?
You mean I think that might be referring to an unassigned. So if you send a log from unassigned to a driver and then they accept it, I actually have a question out to the FMCSA regarding that exact scenario. There's a part of, and this is a bit of a long answer, unfortunately, but there's a part of the Canadian ELD mandate. I know I'm going off script a little bit here, but in the Canadian ELD mandate, it says if a driver picks up unassigned driving through the normal prompts and then realizes that it was wrong, they can put it back into the unassigned driving pile. There's also a guidance from the FMCSA. It's not in the actual law, but we usually treat guidance as part of the law that says the same, that you could have a driver pick up unassigned driving and then put it back. What I asked the FMCSA was, okay, well, if you're letting them do that, do you also allow them to put it back if someone else assigns it to them? So they're not picking it up out of the unassigned driving pile themselves. They've actually been assigned it by their admin. Could we use the same guidance and the same kind of piggyback off of the Canadian rule to let the driver put it back as well if they were assigned it? And I don't have an answer back, but it is something that I want to find out from them, because as soon as we get an answer on that piece, we can then add a new feature into the system to cover all of these scenarios. Now, that particular part though, if an admin assigns an unassigned driver incorrectly and the driver accepts it, that's the part that I'm waiting for an explicit answer on, because it's not clear enough in the guidance or the FAQ yet if that's allowed. I have a feeling that they will allow it, but I just want to make sure that we get there okay, because anything to do with unassigned driving it's just what the officers key in on, and I don't want to have something in the system that makes it look anything other than above board. So as soon as we get an answer from the FMCSA ELD team on that, we can work on that feature so that we can kind of correct those erroneous unassigned driving pieces. But we need to wait for their answer. But as soon as we get it, we'll start work on it.
Awesome. Next question that we have, does the system work in Ontario, Canada for drivers in the 160-kilometer range that need to do a pre-trip and hours of duty?
So for that, it's an interesting question. It really depends on what you want your drivers to be logging, because technically they don't need to actually log hours of service at all. They could basically go on duty and then ignore everything until they go off duty. But they still have to go off duty within enough time to get their 10 hours. So the easy answer is yes, because you could just have them on the regular Canadian rule set, or you could have them on no rule set and just make sure that they themselves are taking enough off-duty time. The advantage to doing the regular Canadian rule set is it will obviously force them to go off duty at the end of the day if they haven't taken any other off-duty time. What I'm thinking about adding, though, as a response to this specifically, is maybe a Canadian rule set that doesn't have all of the extra bells and whistles that you usually have. So like no deferral and no sleeper berth, that kind of thing, to make it easier for drivers who are in this 160 to log in and then log out at the end of the day. So you'd get your login, you get your log out. You would get drive logs in between, but if we structure the rule set in a way, we'd make sure that they'd never break any rules, because we could make them do like a 10-hour consecutive off, which would meet the 10, the 2, it would meet the 8. It would restrict them to only 14 days or 14 hours a day. So there is some talk, and we're working with some other resellers and some of our Canadian companies that use the full ELD solution now to see what we might be able to come up with in terms of like a special rule set. We also have to be cognizant as well that if we do this, we want to make sure that if the driver does go outside of that 160, or for whatever reason has to start logging for that day, they get the 14 days prior as well. Because if they were to get pulled over on that particular day where they're 170 kilometers outside, then they're going to have to show the officer all 14 days. And we want to make sure if they do, that those 14 days don't have any violations in them by accident. So it's a bit of a tightrope. Again, that would be one of those things that if you could either use the feedback button inside of the app or send some feedback through to your reseller or account manager, that would be great, because it's something that we're working on right now in anticipation of the ELD mandate in Canada, even though this is completely outside of the ELD mandate, because we're talking about drivers who don't have to log hours of service. We're going to try to package something for them. We just want to get some feedback as to exactly how we should do that. So it's on the radar, but we just need to know exactly what people are kind of looking for. But we'd love the feedback.
Alrighty, next question we have is, how do I tell what version I have and what is the latest version?
Good question. So if you go into the administration navigation on the left, that your left toolbar inside of my Geotab, and then just go into about, that will then give you a long string for your version number, and you're just looking for 2001 and then ... So there'll be a 2001 and there'll be a bunch of other letters and numbers after that. Everything after the 2001 are just patch numbers, so you don't have to worry about that. It doesn't apply for our big releases. You're just looking for a 2001. If you don't have 2001, you'll actually see it'll say 1904 instead. Another way that you can do it is if you go into that rule section that I talked about and you look at the fleet or the compliance sections, if you see the rules there and they don't have little beakers next to them, it means you're on 2001. If you see them and they have little beakers there, it means you're on 1904 and you have feature preview turned on, because that's how we release beta items. And if you don't see them at all, it means you're definitely on 1904, because you would have to be on 1904 to not see them. So that's another easy way. If you don't want to go into the about section, you can check there too.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kyle. It looks like that was actually the last question that we had for today's session. So that makes it a wrap for this week's Wildcard Wednesday. Thanks again to Kyle for joining us today and sharing this presentation and answering all those questions. If you guys have any other questions that pop into your mind, don't hesitate to reach out to your reseller or your account manager to get those answered, or even just hop into that Geotab community that's linked in the slide deck for you guys. Lots of information available there. With that being said, until next time, I'm Shay Green, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And don't forget, everybody, keep washing those hands.